Margaret Finch had never intended to become a medium. She'd started reading tarot cards at the church fete, then palm readings for friends over tea. It was really all make-believe, and she thought of it as just a little harmless nonsense to supplement her pension. But word spreads quickly in places like Kiderminster, especially when people are desperate to hear what they need to hear. Mrs. Hartwell had been her Tuesday regular for 3 months now. Edna Hartwell was 73, silver-haired, with the careful politeness of someone who'd spent 40 years as a headmistress. She lived alone in a neat 2-bedroom bungalow on Old Mill Road, surrounded by photographs of Harold. Harold in his RAF uniform, Harold in the garden, Harold carving the Christmas turkey with characteristic precision. Harold had been gone 18 months, heart attack while pruning the roses. Quick, they said, merciful. But grief, Margaret had learned, was rarely merciful. Their routine was well established. Margaret would arrive at 8:30, carrying her leather satchel with the candles and her grandmother's brass compass. Edna would have the sitting room prepared, good china tea service waiting, Harold's pocket watch placed ceremoniously in the centre of the small round table. He kept it wound for 40 years, Edna would always say, settling into her chair. Margaret had done her homework, as any good performer must. She knew Harold had built the garden shed himself, refusing help from anyone. She knew he'd had a weakness for bread pudding and a hatred of cats. She knew he'd proposed to Edna on the pier at Weston-super-Mare, and that he'd called her Eddie, never Edna, right up until the end. These details were currency. They bought gasps, tears, and the desperate clutching of hands across the table. "He's here," Margaret would whisper, letting her voice drop to Harold's careful baritone. "He wants you to know he's at peace, Eddie. He's proud of how strong you've been." The transformation was always remarkable. Edna's grief would lift like fog, replaced by something approaching joy. She'd book another session, pay another £60. But tonight, from the moment Margaret stepped through the door, things had felt different. Edna seemed distracted, her usual precise movements replaced by nervous fidgeting. She'd set the table incorrectly, Harold's watch on the wrong side, the candles arranged in no particular order. "Are you quite all right, Mrs. Hartwell?" Margaret asked, settling into her usual chair. "Oh, yes, dear," Edna said hesitantly. "It's just that Harold's been rather talkative today." Margaret nodded sympathetically and began her usual preparation. Dimmed the lights, arranged her hands on the table, waited for the familiar settling sensation that signalled the beginning of her performance. When she spoke, Harold's voice came easily as always. "I'm here, my dear. I've been thinking about you, Eddie." But instead of the usual gasp of recognition, Edna frowned. "That's not right," she said quietly, her schoolmistress voice cutting through the theatrical atmosphere Margaret had worked so hard to create. "I'm sorry. Harold never called me my dear. Never once in 47 years. Edna leaned forward, studying Margaret's face with uncomfortable intensity. "And you're crying, dear. Why are you crying?" Margaret raised a hand to touch her own cheek. Her face was wet and cold. "Mrs. Hartwell, I don't understand." "And Harold's been sitting right behind you for the past 10 minutes, Edna continued. "He wants to know why you're pretending to speak for him." The room suddenly felt colder. Not the theatrical cold Margaret sometimes fabricated with strategic drafts, but a bone-deep chill that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves. She turned slowly in her chair. Harold Hartwell sat in the wing-backed armchair by the window, transparent as morning mist, but unmistakably him. The careful parting in his thinning hair, the patient expression she'd seen in a dozen photographs, the RAF bearing that 40 years of civilian life had never quite erased. He was not pleased. 47 years, he said, and his voice carried the weight of decades, of morning cups of tea and shared newspapers and quiet evenings by the fire. 47 years I spent learning exactly how to talk to my Eddie, her proper name, the things that made her smile, the tone that told her she was loved. Margaret tried to speak but found her voice had abandoned her entirely. "You've been careless with it," Harold continued. "My voice, using it to say things I never would, calling her names I never called her, making promises I can't keep." Edna reached across the table and took Margaret's trembling hands. "It's all right, dear. I've known for weeks you're really quite terrible at it, you know." Her voice was gentle, but firm. "Harold had a very particular way of saying my name. You never got it quite right." "Then why—" Margaret's voice cracked. "Why did you keep—" "Because you needed the money, I could see that. And because sometimes even a poor imitation of comfort is better than none at all." Edna squeezed her hands. "But Harold's here now, really here. He has been for days." Harold stood slowly, his translucent form moving with familiar deliberation. "I've been trying to reach her properly," he said, "but you kept getting in the way. All that noise, all that performance with candles and chanting, it drowns out the real thing." He moved to stand behind Edna's chair, his ghostly hands settling on her shoulders with infinite tenderness. "Hello, Eddie," he said, and the sound of her real name in his true voice was like a key turning in a lock that had been stuck for 18 months. Edna closed her eyes, leaning back into his presence. "Hello, darling, I've been waiting." Margaret gathered her things in the respectful quiet that followed. The candles, the brass compass, the leather satchel that had carried her through months of careful deception. At the door, Edna pressed the usual £60 into her hands. "For services rendered," she said with a knowing smile. "Though perhaps not the services you intended. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm sorry, I never meant to." "You gave me hope, dear, when I had none. That's worth something, even if it wasn't quite real." Edna glanced back toward the sitting room, where Harold's presence still lingered. And sometimes hope is just the bridge you need to reach the truth. As Margaret walked back through the darkening streets of Kiderminster, she could have sworn she heard laughter from the house behind her. Two voices, perfectly matched, sharing some private joke that only 47 years of marriage could create. She never worked as a medium again, but sometimes on quiet Tuesday evenings, she wondered if Harold and Edna were still there, in that neat little bungalow on Old Mill Road. Still talking, still learning the endless vocabulary of love that death could interrupt, but never quite silence.